What's up, everyone? Back in 2013, I started teaching bonsai basics classes for the Bonsai Society of San Francisco. We would go to a nursery and source a bunch of material, usually ideally junipers, and then give them to students to teach them some of the basic concepts in bonsai. So today I'm going to go through some work on these junipers and talk about how to teach bonsai basics, what bonsai basics is, and why this type of juniper is so great for it. There we go. Ooh, that's a big one. And we get a couple from the sides. Now that one's tall, but very skinny. Not use that one. The first thing that I always taught beginners to do with these junipers is to just come along and pull off any downward growing needles that have been relatively shaded, so you can create a little bit of space and see the structure of the plants. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. And this process is basically the removal of just, well, it depends on the plants, I guess, because these have been in a flat together and bunched next to each other. There's less of the downward facing growth than there would be if these were growing spaced apart more. So I'm just going to come along, pull off stuff that's kind of yellowy or weak looking, and expose some more of the structure on a few of these plants. So I'm not making any structural decisions or anything really at this point. I've just sort of pulled off some of the weak growth, and now I'm going to set that aside. When I was teaching these classes, I would usually have 12 to 14 students in a class, and I would be circling around, sort of monitoring them, but inevitably someone would sort of go gung-ho and do their own thing. So I'm going to demonstrate to this plant what the maybe not ideal way to thin a juniper is. So this being reasonably good, what I would sometimes see beginners do in the basics classes is they would kind of come along and be conservative at one point, and then they just seem to keep going and going and going. So hopefully you can see the difference between these two. I was always a little bit aghast when I saw a student do this. When you're thinning a juniper, what you're trying to do is remove foliage that you don't need. And it's hard to know what you need and what you don't need when you're a beginner. But generally the instructions I would give to people are just come along and thin about half the foliage out, leaving some foliage down low in different places and some foliage up high. Don't thin all of the foliage off of the lower inner portions of the tree. Because now with this plant, I don't have anything that I can cut back to in these intersections. And this is going to mean that if I go ahead and wire this, it's already going to start being a little bit leggy. This can be corrected now just with some good growing. It will back bud and create more foliage, but I wanted to do that as an example of not the ideal thinning. With the plants roughly thinned out and hopefully not over thinned, I would move on from the thinning process to a little bit of structural analysis. So it's very common for these junipers to have multiple shoots coming out, and these are Kishu, one of my favorite varieties, a little bit more forgiving than Itoigawa in terms of cutback, and much more able to create nice clouds of foliage without too much trouble, unlike a lot of different juniper cultivars that are common in the nursery industry, because those are used for ground covers essentially. So the shoots that are coming out here, a lot of them are actually, and this is very common, they're a little bit too long to stay in scale with the tree as the trunk size is right now. So as a basics lesson, this is something that I generally just ignore, and we make sort of a loose composition. So if your general proportion for a tree is about 6 times the height of the diameter of the trunk, then basically this is going to be a very small tree because the trunk is only about 1/4 of an inch. So that would mean we get to have an 1.5 inch tall tree. But for a basics lesson, what we're trying to do is we're trying to just pare down a piece of material and convey the idea that working on a plant and creating something different from it is what you do in bonsai. And this is step one essentially in that process, but it's not the final composition when the students leave after a basics class. So obviously, once you've done a little bit of structural analysis, you might be pruning a few branches, but wiring is usually the most productive thing to do. So I'm going to grab a couple of pieces of wire here. So in this case, I'm using aluminum, bright aluminum wire, but you can use copper or colored aluminum wire if you prefer. If the tree doesn't have movement in the lower trunk, I would suggest that you do that first, and you can put a wire in next to the trunk, basically down into the soil to use as an anchor, and then wire in a 45-degree spiral going up the trunk. And as you come to splits, whether it is a branch or the sort of 2 equal pieces, just follow what is either the larger or longer one in general and treat the others as branches. So I'm winding this up, kind of going through the foliage, trying not to smash the foliage down against the stem, and being careful not to clump together shoots. Now the wire I applied here is too small to have bent this larger low section, but that's fine because I didn't really need to do that. So with that wire applied, now it might take you as a beginner a little bit longer to apply the wire than it took me, but with the wire applied, we can then use the wire to bend some of those branches and even twist them if we so choose, which is something that generally speaking is kind of fun for junipers, but a little bit beyond the scope of a basics class. So with all of the branching or major branches wired, it's time to think about shaping the plant. And I have to say, I've seen some people come up with some pretty creative stuff, and I've seen people do a really good job of styling a tree right off the bat, even though they have no experience. And then I have seen a lot of other people do sort of a rudimentary job or have very little understanding of what it is or the patterns of growth that trees naturally create. So, but the concept is the same. We're really just trying to inform the basic students that you shape a bonsai, you create movement, you cut things off, you move things around, and that is part of the point of bonsai. So at this point, I need to, in order to continue styling this, I need to decide sort of where the front is, at least roughly. Because unlike a piece of material that I would be using to create, to grow on, to create a larger, more complex piece of material, what I'm trying to do in these basics classes is just an initial styling and assume that the tree is going to stay relatively the same over the course of a few years. So we're taking this piece of material that's been grown out and we're going into refinement mode essentially. So I'm cutting this off because I think that my front is what I'm looking at right now, which means that you guys are looking at the back. And then a lot of times when I was teaching basics classes, I would have the students do some bending and wiring, but then ask them if they preferred to have me sort of tweak the branches at the end in order to have an experienced eye creating the composition that they actually took home. And those answers varied, but it was kind of fun to see what the students came up with and then modify it and or allow them to just run with their own ideas. So now with the branches roughly bent into position, I'm going to come along and clean up all of the foliage that is sort of going downward. So we cleaned off a little bit of foliage prior to moving the branches, but now we're going to try to create a little bit cleaner look by removing downward facing foliage. Now, before you actually go doing this, you might find that adding an additional wire can take that foliage from just hanging downward like this one and turn it into something that's a little bit more useful. So these guys could be wired out in order to be actual branches rather than having to remove them. So with a few wires put on, that's starting to look a little bit more like a bonsai, but a lot of these are just too long. So I'm going to go ahead and cut some of the branches shorter so that they're more in scale. That's also going to encourage the tree to bud in closer to the center of the composition so that we can keep it a little bit more compact. Using junipers for bonsai basics is nothing new, but after doing it for a while, what I found was my biggest problem was that I couldn't find the material that I needed in order to run the classes. In other words, the local nursery that actually had Kishu available ran out of the Kishu and was not able to propagate them in enough volume to satisfy the number of students that we wanted to have. It was actually one of the reasons why I started Bonsaify.com, because I felt like there needed to be more people propagating good juniper material. And the reason I like Kishu rather than, say, a Procumbens nana is that most people, when they get seriously into bonsai, don't use Procumbens nana as a finished, refined tree. You might have a few of them in your collection, but most people tend to eventually prefer either Itoigawa or Kishu like this. Most garden centers don't have this type of material, so it becomes a little bit of a challenge as a teacher to run a basics class using a good quality juniper. The key thing, or a key thing when you're working with this type of material, is to do aftercare / teach your students to do aftercare, because the process that goes into growing something like this is much longer than what we just took, the amount of time that we just took to transform it into this. But from this point forward, it might take a year or 2 years for the tree to recover from the operation and start to really look like a bonsai and fill in so that it actually looks kind of pretty. Whether you are a student and new to bonsai and want to do basics on your own, or whether you are going to do it in a group as a teacher or as a student, we have these Kishu junipers available on Bonsaify.com for sale, and hopefully I won't run out like the local nursery did. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.